Imagine stepping onto a battlefield where the ground itself is your enemy. Not the barbed wire, not the machine guns, not the artillery, the ground. Imagine mud so deep it pulls men under like a living creature, swallowing them in front of their friends while the officers behind the lines insist the advance must continue. No matter how many drown, no matter how many vanish without a trace. This is not a nightmare. This is the real story of Passchendaele, the dumbest, most horrifying battle of World War I. Before we begin, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. Because today, we re-walking straight into a hell the generals created with nothing but stubborn pride and a total lack of imagination. The year was 1917. Europe had already been bleeding for 3 years. Millions were dead. The Western Front had turned into a long, unmoving scar carved across France and Belgium. Everyone knew the war had reached a point where every offensive meant spending thousands of lives for inches of ground. But Field Marshal Douglas Haig, commander of the British Expeditionary Force, refused to believe that. In his mind, the next attack, the next push, the next great offensive could still deliver the legendary breakthrough that would end the war. He believed it so deeply that no amount of evidence could shake him, not even the ground he stood on. He wanted to break the German line at Ypres, a region the British had already failed to crack twice. The plan was simple on paper: push forward, break through, and take the village of Passchendaele. From there, the British could capture nearby ridges and threaten the German submarine bases on the coast. It sounded strategic, it sounded clean. But Haig ignored a problem so obvious that even soldiers in the trenches joked about how insane the idea was. The entire battlefield lay in the lowest, wettest terrain in Belgium. It was a marsh, even in good weather, and Haig decided to launch his grand offensive in the middle of the wettest summer the region had seen in decades. To understand how bad this decision was, picture standing on a soaked sponge placed on top of a lake. That was the battlefield. Every shell fired by either side churned the ground into deeper mud. Every soldier stepping forward made the ground softer. Eventually, the earth turned into a thick soup of sludge, water, rotting bodies, and broken wood. Horses drowned, pack mules drowned, tanks sank to their turrets. Entire guns vanished into pits. Men would step into what looked like a puddle and never come out. Haig knew all of this before giving the order. His own engineers warned him that the drainage systems in the region were destroyed, and the land, already naturally swampy, had no way to release the water from constant rain. The Germans made it worse by holding the high ground. They could see every movement. They could aim their artillery with deadly accuracy. But Haig continued to believe his dream of the great breakthrough was worth the cost. He claimed the mud would not be a problem. He insisted that the weather would clear. He treated the battlefield like a board game. But this was not a board. It was a grave. At sunrise, on July 31st, 1917, the British launched their assault. Tens of thousands of men climbed out of their trenches expecting to face bullets and shells. What they did not expect was to fight the earth with every step. Imagine trying to walk through knee-deep mud while carrying a rifle. 60 pounds of gear, ammunition, rations, and a gas mask. Now imagine doing this while artillery erupts all around you, sending shock waves that turn the mud into liquid. Men sank slowly at first. They tried to lighten their loads by tossing equipment aside, but it made little difference. Soldiers watched their friends slip deeper and deeper, unable to pull them out. Every rescue attempt risked dragging another man under. You'd think this alone would stop the offensive. Any rational commander would look at the conditions and call off the attack. But Haig pushed them forward again and again. His reports to London insisted that the offensive was progressing well. He described the battlefield as in fair condition. He refused to listen to officers begging him to reconsider. He dismissed any complaints as exaggeration. For Haig, the mud was not an obstacle, it was a small inconvenience. But to the soldiers, it was a death sentence. Stories from the survivors read like scenes from a horror movie. One soldier described watching a comrade sink slowly while screaming for help, his arms reaching out, his face covered in mud. The platoon tried to pull him free, but couldn't. The suction of the ground was too strong. Eventually, they had to leave him because German machine guns were firing. The last thing they heard was his screams fading as the mud filled his mouth. Another soldier recalled watching a horse thrash wildly while its handler tried cutting off its harness to free it. The more the animal struggled, the faster the mud pulled it down. Soon, only its head remained above the surface. Then nothing. Men walking by days later said the ground still bubbled. These stories were not rare. They were daily events. But Haig's only response was to order more attacks. To him, the losses were acceptable. To him, the offensive was going according to plan. His staff officers learned quickly that the best way to keep their jobs was to report progress, even where none existed. This led to an endless cycle of false optimism that fueled more and more assaults across the same killing fields. The mud did not care. It swallowed every new wave of men, the same way it swallowed the last. Every time Haig's men took a few yards of ground, rain washed it away. Shellfire churned it up again. The gains were not strategic. They were temporary illusions. And yet Haig insisted that victory was near. He claimed German morale was collapsing. He was sure that one more push would break their line. But the Germans were not bending. They held the high ground. They had solid trenches built into natural ridges. Their machine guns were dry and stable. The British soldiers advancing uphill through a lake of mud had no chance. The only people bending were the men Haig sent into the storm. If you want to understand how blind Haig was, imagine a hallway filled with traps. Every time someone enters the hallway, they hit a tripwire and die. Most people would stop entering the hallway. Haig would look at the bodies and say, "We're almost there. Send in 20 more." He viewed human beings as numbers on a map. To him, 1,000 deaths did not feel different from 100. He believed it was the duty of the soldier to die for the plan, not the duty of the plan to save the soldier. By the time the first phase of the battle ended, casualties already numbered in the tens of thousands. And this was only the beginning. The ground was getting worse. The weather was getting worse. The morale of the army was breaking, but Haig insisted the offensive must continue. He claimed they were wearing the Germans down. He claimed victory was soon within reach. In reality, nothing of the sort was happening. The Germans were losing men, yes, but nowhere near the scale the British were. Haig refused to see it. His determination had become delusion, and that delusion was about to drag the British army into even deeper hell. This was Passchendaele, a battlefield where the mud killed as many men as the enemy. A battlefield chosen not by strategy, but by stubborn pride. A battlefield where every decision came from a commander who never saw the suffering up close. And this disaster was only beginning. In the next part, you'll see how Haig doubled down on the madness, pushing his men deeper into the swamp as he chased a victory that did not exist. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian, because we're just getting started with the nightmare of Passchendaele. The Battle of Passchendaele was not just a disaster because of stubborn generals or foolish orders. It was a disaster that Haig's own planning had created, almost as if he had deliberately designed a battlefield where success was impossible. One of the deadliest mistakes, the one that transformed ordinary mud into a lethal trap, was the preliminary artillery bombardment. On paper, this seemed like a smart plan. Softening the enemy lines before sending in infantry is standard military logic. But Haig and his staff overlooked a crucial environmental factor. They were operating in the Flanders Plain, a landscape already prone to flooding. It is flat, marshy, and riddled with canals. Water collects everywhere. Rain turns up into a swamp. Every shell crater becomes a pond. Every trench fills with water, sometimes ankle deep, sometimes waist deep, sometimes even deep enough to swallow a man completely. The landscape had no natural way to drain the rain, and no way to recover from the disruption caused by constant shelling. The British bombardment did something far worse than destroy the German defenses. It destroyed the very ground they would have to cross. Imagine millions of shells tearing through a field already wet from rain and river overflow. Trees were obliterated. Drainage ditches became massive craters. Roads disappeared. Any stable path vanished under tons of broken earth. The soft clay and peat of the region turned into a deadly, sticky slurry. Soldiers stepping into what they thought were trenches or dry patches often found themselves trapped in chest-deep mud. Horses carrying ammunition or artillery sank up to their bellies. Men carrying their rifles, backpacks, and rations floundered, helpless, while shells continued to fall around them. A soldier, who might have survived bullets or machine gun fire, could drown slowly in mud and water, helpless against the suction of the churned-up earth. The timing made everything worse. The bombardment was supposed to weaken the Germans, but it coincided with one of the heaviest periods of autumn rain in decades. Flanders, already a floodplain, quickly turned into a giant, waterlogged swamp. The shell craters filled with water almost immediately, creating ponds scattered across the battlefield. Each crater became a trap. Men would fall in while running or trying to take cover. Once in, they could not get out without help, and any help meant risking another soldier sinking into the mud beside them. Many drowned slowly, while comrades could only watch, their hands slipping through muck and water as they tried to pull friends to safety. Horses, mules, and even heavy artillery wagons disappeared entirely into the waterlogged craters. Adding to the chaos and visual horror of the battlefield, soldiers later described the ground as a liquid field and walking into a swamp of death. The bombardment had another, less obvious effect. It destroyed any remaining sense of order. Soldiers could not use landmarks because the shelling obliterated everything recognizable. Roads were gone, trees were shattered. Trenches were unrecognizable as holes in the earth, filled with water and corpses. Men often could not tell if they were advancing or circling back, or even if they were heading toward the German line. The mud became a trap for movement and a trap for morale. Units broke down into fragments. Officers lost track of their men. Any coordination that remained became impossible to enforce. The bombardment had achieved its goal of chaos, but it was chaos for the attackers, not the defenders. What made this self-sabotage worse was that the British artillery had failed to achieve a crucial goal, destroying the German defenses. The German positions, dug into slightly higher ground, remained intact enough to fire from cover. Machine gun nests perched safely on ridges raked the mud and water with bullets. Artillery shells that might have gone to clear obstacles had instead flattened the land itself, creating the deadly quagmire that would now stop every advancing wave. The British had turned the battlefield into a deadly mixture of mud and enemy firepower. Every step forward required slogging through chest-high mud, dodging bullets, and maintaining coordination with men whose own boots were sinking into the same earth. The very weapon meant to help them, artillery, had become an instrument of self-destruction. The rain made the situation unbearable. A light drizzle might have been manageable, but the persistent autumn rain poured steadily, filling the shell craters and mixing with the churned-up clay to form a sticky, suffocating slurry. Soldiers who managed to get a few yards ahead often had to stop in waist-deep mud, unable to move their legs forward. Any attempt to lift a leg would pull it deeper into the sludge. If a man fell, he became trapped immediately, unable to rise or crawl. Those behind him sometimes tried to help, only to be pulled under themselves. The mud was heavy, sticky, unyielding, and everywhere. The rain also soaked clothes, making uniforms heavier, reducing mobility, and causing frostbite in colder weather. Men huddled together in waterlogged trenches, exhausted and soaked to the bone, only to be ordered forward again. This self-inflicted disaster turned every aspect of the battle into a nightmare. Artillery fire continued, but it was largely ineffective because mud absorbed and softened the impact of many shells. At the same time, mud prevented soldiers from taking cover quickly. The closest trench could be 5 yards away, but in chest-deep mud, even a short sprint was impossible. Communication broke down. Signal flares could not be seen through rain and smoke. Runners carrying orders became immobilized. Men at the front advanced blindly, unsure whether they were leading or following, trapped in a quagmire created by the very forces meant to protect them. The results were catastrophic. Horses, which had been essential for moving supplies, ammunition, and artillery, sank into mud almost immediately. Hundreds were lost in the first day. Men tried to drag ammunition crates or machine guns across the battlefield, only to watch the mud swallow their load and their hands as they struggled. Corpses of the fallen clogged the shell craters, making any movement even harder. The mud did not distinguish between the living and the dead, pulled both under with equal disregard. Some men survived bullets, only to die in the mire. Some officers ordered men forward only to watch them disappear beneath the surface. The psychological toll was enormous. Soldiers reported that it was impossible to maintain morale. Exhaustion was universal. Hunger and thirst added to fatigue. Men were wet for days at a time, with no dry clothes or shelter. Constant shelling prevented them from resting. They could not find solid ground to eat or sleep. Every step forward was a struggle against both enemy fire and the environment itself. Letters written home were filled with despair, describing mud that was like a living thing, dragging men to death, choking them, consuming their boots and weapons. Some described it as sucking the life out of you in a trap laid by God and man combined. The irony was brutal. Haig's artillery was intended to make the ground easier to cross, to destroy German positions and enable a breakthrough. Instead, it guaranteed a slow-motion massacre. Men were trapped, horses were trapped, artillery was trapped, and every attempt to advance became an exercise in futility. Haig's insistence on continuing attacks, despite clear environmental warnings, turned what should have been an advantage into an absolute liability. In other words, he sabotaged his own offensive before the first shot even landed. This disaster highlights one of the central lessons of Passchendaele. Terrain, weather, and preparation matter as much as manpower or artillery. Ignoring environmental factors like shelling a low-lying marsh during an unusually wet season turns even the strongest army into helpless victims. Haig's failure to adapt, to pause, or to reconsider demonstrates how arrogance and stubbornness can create catastrophe faster than any enemy can. By the end of the first week, the battlefield was a swamp filled with struggling, dying men, crushed horses, and destroyed equipment. Every advance was measured in yards, every gain temporary, every loss immense. Soldiers learned quickly that survival depended not on skill or bravery alone, but on the ability to fight the ground itself. Men improvised by using planks to cross shell craters, forming human chains to drag comrades from sinking mud, or abandoning equipment entirely to reduce weight. Entire attacks failed because the mud moved slower than the soldiers. Artillery shells, meant to provide cover, sometimes killed men buried in mud instead of enemy troops. And still, Haig ordered successive waves forward, convinced that perseverance alone would break the German line. In sum, the combination of Haig's artillery plan, the destruction of drainage systems, and relentless autumn rains transformed Passchendaele into one of the most horrifying environments in military history. Soldiers did not just fight the enemy, they fought the mud, water, and the consequences of strategic miscalculations. Thousands perished without ever even encountering a German bayonet. The battlefield was not an obstacle to be overcome, was a killer in itself, deliberately created by a general who refused to see reality. The disaster of self-sabotage at Passchendaele serves as a grim reminder that sometimes the deadliest enemy is not the soldier across the field, but the mistakes made by your own side. The combination of environmental ignorance, poorly timed artillery, and stubborn pride turned what should have been a military operation into a living nightmare for the men of the British Expeditionary Force. By the time autumn was fully underway, the battlefield was no longer just a place of combat. It had become a swamp of death-sucking men under as surely as any enemy soldier could, and all because of decisions made far from the mud and water in offices and on maps. This is the tragic lesson of Passchendaele. Even the most modern army, armed with artillery, planning, and technology, is powerless when strategic decisions ignore the most basic factors of terrain, weather, and human endurance. At Passchendaele, the enemy was not only the German army, the enemy was the mud itself. Once the initial artillery barrage and relentless rain had churned the Flanders plain into a quagmire, the very ground became a lethal adversary. Soldiers advancing toward the German lines faced what could only be described as a crawling nightmare. Every step required enormous effort. Boots sank into chest-high mud, dragging soldiers down. Every attempt to lift a leg meant risking collapse. Some men were trapped in shell craters filled with water and could not free themselves without assistance. Many drowned slowly in the mud, while others watched, powerless to help. The mud was a constant, unrelenting force, sapping strength, morale, and even the will to move forward. The infantry could no longer conduct a traditional advance. In a normal battle, soldiers might move in formation, using cover and maintaining cohesion. At Passchendaele, such coordination was impossible. Men were separated instantly by mud-filled craters, tangled barbed wire, and collapsed trenches. Units broke apart into fragments. Officers struggled to maintain any semblance of command, shouting orders that could not be heard over the noise of artillery and the squelching of boots in the mud. Some men were so exhausted by the effort of simply lifting their legs that they could not continue fighting even when under fire. The mud, combined with enemy fire, became a perfect trap. Soldiers could be shot while stuck in a crater, unable to dodge or take cover, or they could drown or succumb to exhaustion before even reaching the German lines. Movement of supplies and artillery was equally crippled. Wagons and carts sank into the mud, sometimes irretrievably, leaving ammunition, food, and medical supplies stranded. Horses, vital for carrying loads, were trapped or drowned in shell craters. Artillery pieces could not be repositioned effectively, leaving infantry without the suppressive fire they desperately needed. Even stretcher bearers struggled, often abandoning their wounded because it was physically impossible to drag them through the thick mud. Soldiers sometimes tried to form human chains to pull comrades free, but the mud made such efforts exhausting and often fatal if the trapped man or rescuer slipped under. The mud also exacerbated exposure and exhaustion. Men were soaked for hours, sometimes days, with no dry clothing or shelter. Cold water and shell craters caused rapid loss of body heat, leading to hypothermia. Exhaustion and hunger were constant companions. Soldiers were carrying heavy equipment, their clothing and boots weighed down by water and mud, making every movement a battle. A simple march of a few hundred meters could take hours, leaving men completely spent before even engaging the enemy. Some collapsed in the mud and were left behind, either to drown or to be killed by enemy fire. Death from environmental conditions alone became common. The tactical failure of the offensive was compounded by these conditions. Haig and his staff had planned for a straightforward infantry advance with artillery support, but the mud rendered all pre-battle planning useless. Machine gun positions and barbed wire that might have been cleared by artillery remained effective obstacles. German troops, relatively secure on higher ground and with some shelters intact, could fire with near impunity on soldiers struggling in the quagmire. Every attempt to flank or maneuver became impossible. Soldiers became easy targets. Casualties mounted not because of courage or tactical errors alone, but because the terrain itself was a weapon wielded against them. Logistical operations ground to a halt. Ammunition could not reach frontline troops in time, and medical evacuation became nearly impossible. Wounded soldiers often had to lie in the mud for hours or days before any help could reach them, increasing mortality rates. The mud became a secondary killer, as infection from exposure and unsanitary conditions added to battlefield injuries. Many men succumbed to gangrene, hypothermia, or exhaustion rather than direct enemy fire. Even acts of heroism, like dragging a comrade to safety, were slowed to a crawl by the mud, making success uncertain and often temporary. Communication also suffered. Signalers could not move fast enough to carry messages. Runners became bogged down. Flare signals were obscured by rain, smoke, and fog. Commanders could not coordinate attacks, call for reinforcements, or adjust artillery fire effectively. The combination of environmental chaos and enemy fire created a perfect storm where every decision had delayed consequences and every movement carried unpredictable risk. Soldiers were trapped between the two most dangerous forces, enemy fire and the merciless mud. The mud turned every tactical maneuver into a struggle for survival. Any attempt to cross no man's land was a calculated risk of life or death. A soldier could advance only a few yards before stopping to rest, often sinking deeper with each pause. Platoons became spread thin, losing the support of neighboring units. Soldiers became isolated, making them more vulnerable to sniper fire and machine gun nests. Entire attacks stalled in shell craters, turning the offensive into a horrific hour-by-hour fight to gain minimal ground. Even basic survival became an exercise in extreme endurance. Soldiers had to find stable footing, avoid collapsing into shell holes, and manage exhaustion while carrying heavy packs. Mud would pull boots off feet, entangle weapons, and make climbing out of trenches nearly impossible. Fatigue and frustration grew with each step. Men became mentally and physically worn out before encountering the enemy. This exhaustion contributed to higher casualty rates and a breakdown in morale, as soldiers realized that the battlefield itself was fighting against them more effectively than the Germans could. Environmental hazards compounded psychological trauma. Men witnessed comrades drowning in mud-filled craters or being crushed under fallen equipment. The sound of artillery combined with the squelch of soldiers' movements created a continuous reminder of the struggle. The knowledge that survival required more than courage, that it required sheer luck to traverse mud without becoming a casualty, added to fear and despair. Soldiers described the battlefield as a living entity that punished every mistake and consumed all effort. The mud also amplified tactical errors and poor planning. Haig's insistence on pushing successive waves forward turned the natural obstacles into executioners. The The army's numerical advantage was neutralized by environmental resistance. Soldiers could not maintain formation, execute flanking maneuvers, or capitalize on breakthroughs. Every inch gained was temporary and hard-won. Artillery that might have cleared the path became useless because shell craters were now filled with water. Communications broke down, leaving men without orders and officers without oversight. Progress became measured in yards, casualties in thousands. Medical operations were disastrous. Wounded soldiers were often left in mud-filled craters for hours, with exposure worsening injuries. Hypothermia, frostbite, infections, and exhaustion claimed more lives than direct combat. Ambulances and stretchers could not navigate the quagmire. Corpses were left to decompose in mud alongside living men, contributing to unsanitary conditions and demoralization. The battlefield was no longer a site of conventional warfare, but a trap where men struggled against nature and circumstance as much as against an armed enemy. Supply chains collapsed under the weight of mud. Rations, water, and ammunition could not reach advancing troops. Soldiers scavenged supplies from dead comrades or abandoned positions. Equipment sank into craters. Horses, previously essential for transport, became casualties themselves. The offensive slowed to a crawl, dependent on improvisation and brute strength rather than strategy. Ultimately, fighting the mud became more consuming than firing the Germans. Soldiers were trapped in an environment designed unintentionally by artillery, miscalculations, and compounded by weather. Their physical, mental, and moral strength was tested to the extreme. Many perished not from bullets, but from exhaustion, drowning, and exposure. The battlefield itself was a weapon of immense power, a testament to the consequences of strategic ignorance and poor planning. Passchendaele demonstrates that environmental factors can become more lethal than enemy forces when ignored. The mud dictated the pace, dictated casualties, and rendered traditional tactics obsolete. Success on such a battlefield required not bravery alone, but a combination of endurance, improvisation, and luck. The army was effectively fighting both the Germans and the deadly ground itself. The final reckoning of the Battle of Passchendaele was measured not in territory but in human cost. After months of relentless fighting, the British and Allied forces had advanced only about 5 miles. 5 miles of mud, blood, and exhaustion. This advance, meant to secure strategic advantage and break the German lines, came at an almost incomprehensible cost. An estimated 325,000 Allied casualties and over 260,000 German casualties. The figures alone reveal the magnitude of the disaster, but the human suffering behind those numbers is even more staggering. Each casualty represented a story of immense struggle. Soldiers had endured days of rain-soaked trench life, their feet rotting in waterlogged boots, carrying heavy packs that now weighed exponentially more as mud accumulated. The exhaustion of fighting both the enemy and the battlefield itself left them mentally and physically depleted. Many soldiers drowned or were crushed in shell craters. Others succumbed to hypothermia, infection, or starvation. The battlefield was so saturated and unforgiving that death often came without a single bullet striking the victim. Some men were found floating in mud-filled craters, their bodies contorted by the impossible terrain, others pinned by collapsed earth. The 5-mile advance was not a traditional military triumph. Instead, it was a slow, agonizing crawl measured in yards at a time. Soldiers had to pull themselves through mud while under constant fire, facing barbed wire, machine gun nests, and artillery bombardment. Every step forward required collective effort from men already at the limits of endurance. Commanders attempted to enforce discipline and cohesion, but the mud dissolved formations and left units scattered and disorganized. The battlefield itself dictated movement, strategy, and survival, and the general's plans could not overcome this environmental obstacle. Casualty rates further illustrate the disproportionate cost of the offensive. For every yard gained, hundreds of men were killed or wounded. Medical services were overwhelmed. Field hospitals became makeshift morgues, unable to cope with the volume of suffering. Many wounded men never received aid, left to die in mud-filled trenches or exposed to artillery fire. The constant loss of comrades devastated morale. Letters home were scarce, and the few survivors carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. Passchendaele is remembered as a stark example of attrition warfare, where human life was expendable in the pursuit of minimal territorial gains. The decision to continue the offensive despite such conditions highlights a key strategic failure. Field Marshal Haig, often criticized for his stubbornness and detachment from frontline reality, pushed forward with an objective that ignored both environmental and human limitations. Rain and artillery had transformed the battlefield into a near-impassable swamp, yet successive waves of soldiers were ordered into the mire. The general's focus on the plan rather than the feasibility turned the operation into a campaign of attrition. Their determination to achieve a strategic goal outweighed any consideration of the suffering required to reach it. The 5-mile advance demonstrates the dissonance between military ambition and ground reality. Strategically, the ground taken was of marginal value. Tactically, it required enormous human effort. Soldiers who survived were often too exhausted to capitalize on the minimal gains. In many cases, positions had to be abandoned due to inability to hold them effectively. The offensive became less about defeating the enemy and more about fulfilling orders and maintaining appearances with little regard for the human cost. German forces, though equally battered, often had the advantage of higher ground and more secure positions. They could observe Allied movements and exploit the mud to create killing zones. Machine guns and artillery were devastatingly effective against soldiers slowed by terrain. Even attempts to flank or maneuver were hampered. The Germans, while suffering heavy casualties, were able to inflict disproportionate damage simply because the battlefield worked against their opponents. The human experience of the battle is one of endurance beyond imagination. Soldiers describe the quagmire as a living enemy, a relentless force that consumed men, horses, and equipment indiscriminately. Daily life involved slogging through mud, hauling wounded comrades, and digging or reinforcing trenches that continually collapsed under rain. Sleep was nearly impossible, food and water scarce, and morale fragile. The mud dictated the pace of action, the possibilities for strategy, and the likelihood of survival. Communication lines broke down entirely in many sectors. Runners could not navigate the terrain, telegraph, and telephone wires were destroyed by shellfire and mud, and officers could not coordinate attacks effectively. Units often advanced blindly, without knowledge of the larger tactical picture. The chaos increased casualties and made any temporary gains extremely fragile. Soldiers relied on local initiative and brute force to survive, rather than the clear guidance of their commanders. The massive casualty figures reflect not only deaths in combat, but also the toll of environmental hazards and exhaustion. Thousands of men suffered from trench foot, hypothermia, malnutrition, and infection. Horses and transport animals died en masse, adding to the logistical nightmare. Supplies could not reach the front lines consistently, further weakening soldiers, physically and mentally. Every day on the battlefield represented a struggle against nature as much as against the enemy. Psychologically, the battle inflicted deep trauma. Witnessing friends and comrades perish in mud-filled craters, watching waves of soldiers mown down by machine guns, and experiencing relentless artillery bombardment created conditions ripe for shell shock. The sensory overload, sights, sounds, and smells, combined with helplessness against both the enemy and the mud, created long-term mental scars for survivors. Passchendaele became synonymous with futility and suffering, an emblem of World War I's industrialized horror. The strategic goal of capturing territory was overshadowed by the staggering human cost. While Haig and his staff pursued the offensive, the soldiers' survival became the most immediate concern. Every ordered advance risked hundreds of lives for a gain of mere yards. The 5-mile advance was won at the cost of nearly 500,000 casualties, making each inch of territory an expensive testament to poor planning and stubborn command decisions. Passchendaele epitomizes the dangers of rigid adherence to plans in the face of overwhelming environmental obstacles. Haig's insistence on continuing the offensive demonstrates a disconnect between command and reality on the ground. Generals measured success in territorial gain, while the soldiers measured survival. The gulf between these perspectives magnified the human cost and cemented the Battle-S reputation as one of the dumbest and deadliest in modern history. The battle also underscores the limitations of early 20th century technology in extreme conditions. Artillery, designed to soften enemy defenses, instead destroyed the terrain and worsened mobility. Horses, essential for supply lines, could not traverse the mud. Infantry tactics reliant on coordinated advances and communication collapsed. Nature became a weapon as lethal as any German machine gun. Every step taken by soldiers was a testament to human endurance. men dragged themselves through waist-deep mud, hauling equipment and weapons often under enemy fire. Those who fell sometimes could not be retrieved before dying. The advance, minimal as it was, represents the resilience of soldiers faced with extraordinary adversity. Yet it also symbolizes the enormous cost of inflexible command and poor strategic foresight. Passchendaele's 5-mile advance reminds historians and strategists alike of the perils of attritional warfare. Victory in terms of territory is hollow when paid for in staggering human suffering. The lessons of the battlefield extend beyond World War I, serving as a stark warning against prioritizing plans over people, objectives over human life, and pride over pragmatism. In summary, the advance of 5 miles was a Pyrrhic achievement. Every yard cost hundreds of lives. Every moment of progress was a struggle against mud, exhaustion, exposure, and enemy fire. Soldiers endured conditions that were more lethal than the battlefield in conventional terms. The Battle of Passchendaele remains a haunting example of the deadly consequences when leadership ignores reality, when strategy is divorced from the environment, and when human life is subordinated to ambition. Passchendaele stands today as more than a battle. It is a stark monument to the consequences of strategic hubris and environmental miscalculation. The relentless advance of 5 miles, achieved at the staggering cost of hundreds of thousands of lives, encapsulates the tragedy of World War I's Western Front. When historians look back at the campaign, the figures are horrifying. An estimated 325,000 Allied casualties and over 260,000 German losses. But the raw numbers failed to convey the human agony that unfolded in those rain-soaked fields of Flanders, where mud became as deadly as any enemy weapon. The battle's enduring legacy lies in the way it exemplifies the senselessness of attritional warfare. Soldiers were caught between the dictates of command and the brutal realities of the battlefield. The trenches and shell-cratered plains, transformed by relentless artillery and autumn rains, were nearly impassable. Men often fought more against the mud than the German army. Horses, vital for moving supplies and artillery, were trapped, exhausted, or drowned. The terrain itself became an instrument of death, claiming lives indiscriminately and rendering carefully drawn strategies useless. Commanders like Field Marshal Douglas Haig, however, remained committed to the original plan, prioritizing the advance over human survival. This disconnect between leadership and frontline reality is one of the most frequently cited reasons Passchendaele is remembered as a dumb battle textbook example of strategic failure despite clear warning signs. The psychological toll on soldiers was immense. Beyond the physical dangers of drowning in mud or being caught in artillery fire, the constant exposure to death and suffering created lasting trauma. Men watched their comrades die slowly in mud-filled craters or succumb to infection and hypothermia. The sheer hopelessness of advancing only 5 miles over months intensified despair. Letters sent home carried only fragments of the horror. Many soldiers never wrote at all, their voices silenced by exhaustion, injury, or death. Those who survived returned with the scars of trauma that would shape a generation and influence the collective memory of World War I. From a tactical perspective, the battle revealed the limitations of early 20th century military technology when confronted with extreme environmental conditions. Artillery, intended to weaken enemy defenses, inadvertently destroyed the very landscape needed for troop movement. Barbed wire became embedded in waterlogged soil, machine guns cut down soldiers trapped in mud, and supply lines collapsed under the impossible conditions. Traditional strategies of coordinated infantry advances, relying on speed and communication, were rendered ineffective. In essence, the battlefield itself dictated the terms of engagement, turning planning and hierarchy into irrelevant abstractions. The advance of 5 miles, while technically a gain, was ultimately hollow. Every inch gained demanded enormous effort and countless lives, yet the strategic value of that ground was limited. It did not decisively weaken the German army, nor did it create a lasting advantage for the Allies. Instead, the minimal gains starkly highlighted the cost of rigid adherence to flawed plans. Soldiers were expected to obey orders in an environment where survival often seemed impossible. Underscoring the imbalance between command priorities and human reality, the human stories behind these statistics are chilling. Soldiers waded through waist-deep mud, dragging themselves and their equipment across terrain that offered no cover and few opportunities for rest. Entire units were isolated, communications broke down, and frontline cohesion collapsed under the strain. Many soldiers died not from bullets or shells, but from exhaustion, exposure, or drowning. Medical services were overwhelmed, and field hospitals were quickly filled with men too badly injured to survive, turning rescue efforts into a desperate scramble against time and terrain. The battlefield consumed not just men, but also horses, artillery, and morale, leaving devastation in its wake. Passchendaele also highlighted the failures of leadership under extreme conditions. Haig and his staff committed to a predetermined plan, failed to account for weather, terrain, and the realities of troop endurance. Their insistence on pressing forward, despite evidence that conditions made success improbable, exemplifies a tragic combination of ego, pride, and strategic inflexibility. Decisions were made in isolation from the experiences of soldiers on the ground, and the result was catastrophic. The battle demonstrates how leadership disconnected from reality can magnify human suffering exponentially. The Germans, while defending, also faced severe challenges. Yet their positions were fortified, and the defensive advantage allowed them to inflict maximum casualties with minimal exposure. For them, Passchendaele was a brutal test of endurance, but one mitigated by preparation and terrain familiarity. The disparity between the attacker's experience and the defender's position further underscores the disproportionate cost of the offensive for the Allies. Every foot of ground gained was purchased at immense human expense, while the strategic benefit remained marginal. Psychologically, the battle left an indelible mark on collective memory. The phrase "wading through mud to die" became synonymous with World War I's industrialized slaughter. Soldiers endured conditions so extreme that their own survival became secondary to the pursuit of orders. Letters, diaries, and post-war memoirs describe the relentless mud, the stench of decay, and the omnipresence of death. This psychological legacy contributed to the widespread perception of the war as a series of futile exercises in attrition, with little regard for human cost. Passchendaele embodies that perception more than almost any other battle. The ultimate lesson of Passchendaele is one of human limits and the consequences of ignoring them. It demonstrates how rigid planning, combined with environmental misjudgment and command ego, can turn even well-equipped armies into tragic casualties. The battle's 5-mile gain was insignificant compared to the staggering cost: lives, morale, and faith in leadership. It serves as a historical warning that the success of a military campaign cannot be measured solely in territorial gain or adherence to strategy, but must include consideration of human endurance and environmental realities. In British and Commonwealth military history, Passchendaele remains a symbol of futility. Memorials and cemeteries scattered across Flanders commemorate the lives lost, preserving the memory of soldiers who suffered under conditions that were almost inconceivably harsh. These sites stand as reminders of the high human cost of strategic errors and the dangers of prioritizing ambition over survival. The battle continues to be studied as a cautionary tale, not only in military academies, but also in discussions of leadership, decision-making, and the human cost of war. Despite its horrors, Passchendaele has also come to represent resilience. Soldiers endured unimaginable suffering and continued to follow orders under conditions that would have broken lesser individuals. Their perseverance, while often overshadowed by strategic failures, demonstrates remarkable courage and endurance. Yet the enduring lesson is clear. Bravery and endurance cannot compensate for flawed planning or the failure to adapt to the realities of the battlefield. In many ways, Passchendaele defines the Western Front itself, a landscape where human ambition clashed tragically with environmental reality, where strategy met mud, and where the human cost far exceeded any measurable gain. It reminds us that war is not merely about territory or victory, but about the lives that are entrusted to leadership, the limits of human endurance, and the consequences of decisions made far from the front lines. The Battle of Passchendaele's legacy, as the ultimate symbol of futility, endures because it encapsulates all these elements: strategic miscalculation, environmental disaster, human suffering, and minimal gain. It continues to resonate as a historical example of the deadly consequences when planning ignores reality and leadership disregards the well-being of those it commands. This battle, more than any other, demonstrates how dumb decisions in warfare can lead to catastrophic human costs. The fields of Flanders, now quiet and green, hide the scars of mud, shell craters, and mass graves. But the story of Passchendaele remains vivid in history. The battle exemplifies the horrors of trench warfare, the limits of military technology under extreme conditions, and the human cost of inflexible command. By studying Passchendaele, we honor the memory of those who suffered and learn critical lessons about the interplay between leadership, environment, and human endurance. The memory of Passchendaele should not only remind us of the cost of war, but also encourage reflection on decision-making, humility in leadership, and the importance of adapting plans to reality. It is a battlefield lesson that remains relevant today, emphasizing that progress at any cost can be a Pyrrhic victory, and that human life should never be subordinate to ambition or pride. Passchendaele will forever remain etched in history as the ultimate symbol of futility, a campaign where ambition, environmental disaster, and human cost collided tragically, leaving a legacy of caution, remembrance, and profound reflection on the true price of war.